Protect you and me first. This is something that is not shown a lot.
Where it all started.
I do think that, I think maybe at first glance might not be too much in common, but I think there are a lot of, points of connection between these two things. I guess to start with, I want to start with Daniel, actually. Not to ask the magician to reveal secrets, but what did you think of this man? Did you imagine a life for him outside of the few minutes that we spend with him?
Oh, golly. So long ago. Nice to see everyone, first of all. Nice to be out of the house. Say it again, Charles. I'm so very sorry.
Well, this character, I think, in the time that we spend with him, he's defined in this very, we have very little to go on. Did you imagine what his life is like beyond this time that we spend with him, who this man is?
I'm sure I did.
Probably, yeah.
At the time, Brady was a mere teenager when he made that movie with me, and when I found out that we were going to be talking about these things, I did go back and reflect upon that short film, and I think that there's a thing that people do. They look for connection, and if something's missing, maybe that connection can come in a disturbing or violent way. You know what I mean? Like, if we're looking for connection, it's not always going to be something beautiful or happy. And so I feel like in this film, this character, this man, wants connection, and you hear about people who are, they're looking for like a dopamine hit, perhaps, and that dopamine hit doesn't necessarily come from something that we think of as being pleasurable. A dopamine hit can come from an argument or an angry exchange or a violent exchange. So, and reflecting back on that movie from all those years ago, that kind of resonated with me with what that character maybe was going through, and he was looking for something that was missing, a connection of some sort.
There's I forget who, but there's a great story from a stand-up comedian where they got a heckler who just yelled, "I exist." I feel like that's a very similar principle, just looking to, be acknowledged in some way.
Yeah.
In that incredible shot that goes down the street, we can almost hear the wear on your voice as you keep repeating this phrase. Do you remember the physical experience at all of shooting that? Was it did you feel yourself getting, hoarse as you were going?
I do remember it. We were just below Canal Street shooting that. I remember the block we were on, and I remember, I think we did a few takes, and by maybe the third or so take, people were getting really upset, like, "Shut the fuck up!" And I remember that motivated me, and it took me to an even more intense place, and that's when I really felt like, oh boy, like my voice was really going at that point.
Brady, so I think in your features, your preoccupations seem very consistent. I noticed it's very fleeting, but Nazis make an appearance in all three of your features. It's about systems of power and fascism. Were these things on your mind? At this very early juncture of your career, what sort of thematic things were weighing on you that you wanted to put on film?
It's a difficult thing for me to speak summarily of in a way. I suppose that I've always been interested, when Mona and I sit down to write a screenplay, we often talk about what's happening sort of in the corridors of the narrative, which is to say that, most narrative films, because you only have 2 to possibly 4 hours to tell your story, that you are sort of jumping from bullet point to bullet point. And of course that becomes something that is essentially algorithmic and becomes quite tedious for viewers. So I'm really genuinely interested in sort of the moments that precede or follow what you anticipate coming on screen. And so, you know, I think that with a short film in particular, a short film is an exercise. So I know that, I even knew then that 10 minutes is not enough time for someone to become invested in something. But I did think maybe 10 minutes is enough time for audiences to feel sort of confronted by it. And I knew it made me feel very uncomfortable, and I knew that when it was over, I didn't really know what to do with myself. And I thought that was interesting for a room full of people to experience that together. You know, in all seriousness, I do think that there are, you know, I've seen my fair share of shows where, you know, I arrive and a musician takes his instrument apart, puts it back together again, and that's the show. And I find that really interesting because I have gotten to a point as a viewer, as a film viewer, where I'm not that interested in melody anymore. Just because there's only so many ways to put the combination of pleasing notes together. So I'm very interested in doing things that are, you know, more or less in poor taste. And I'm interested in poor taste and what is the difference really between good taste and bad taste, and that's something that this film in particular, I mean, the feature really, of course, grapples with. Like, after I made The Childhood of a Leader, I was so tired of being up to my, you know, throat in lace and linen from the early 20th century that I thought, let's do a film on pleather, and which is why the film, you know, concludes with a very, very long shot of this vegan leather jacket that is, you know, is objectively hideous, but it's interesting and it's iconic. And I'm fascinated by the fact that the more hideous, somehow the more iconic, and that's something that this generation seems to really cherish.
That's why I dressed so hideously today to come up here. Absolutely. You mentioned, you know, this element of the confrontational. This film is playing here as part of Bleak Week, and those first 5 minutes, dear God. I remember I saw the film for the first time in Toronto, and I had colleagues who I think after those first 5 minutes were off the bus immediately. That's such a big choice to make, to open your screenplay. For you and Mona, what went into that decision, which is, you know, a huge decision narratively?
It was always the way that the story was supposed to open. This is what the story was about. So I remember when Brady went to Toronto. I didn't go to Toronto for the screening of VOX, but I remember Brady went and he was asked to warn the audience about the scene ahead of it. And I remember you saying, I'm not comfortable doing that. It had just been a horrible shooting in Canada. And, you know, Brady said, I'm from Colorado. Like, this is something that happens in our country all the time. Like, I can't apologize for telling a story about this. It's, you know, I'm so sorry this happened to you, but this happens again and again and again and again in America.
I saw in 2022 a headline that the survivor of the Oxford High School shooting went on America's Got Talent. Mm-hmm. Made it to the semifinals.
Yeah.
I think this film, much like The Brutalist in terms of building the screenplay, it has this kind of bisected structure, that The Brutalist is divided by the intermission, sort of in the same way that this movie is divided by the time jump. Could you two talk about your theory of structure? I think you see movies I don't think are really built like this very often.
Yeah, no, we really enjoyed that structure. We were really criticized for it. But everyone said there's no middle. We said, well, you've seen the middle. That's the Star Spawn. You can, you know, that's that. And now you get the very beginning and then you get the end, but you don't. The middle, we know that story. That part of the story is so familiar. It's not interesting to us.
Yeah, but I think it makes the transformation so incredibly brutal, because there's this fascinating thing with icons where, you know, if they're from a place, later in life they become extremely from a place. And I was sort of fascinated by the fact that, of course, something that crops up over and over again with, you know, popular performers, both, you know, actors and musicians alike, where they sort of they adopt a way of speaking that is, you know, absolutely, you know, not the way that they speak, and I found that really interesting. And of course, everyone was extremely concerned about it because they were like, well, she doesn't speak this way in the first half, and then in the second half she speaks in this other way. And I said, yes, but it's much more brutal. It's much more violent this way because it's so confrontational. It's dialed up to 11 in a way that the first half of the film is minimalism, the second half of the film is maximalism, the first half of the film is, quote unquote, like good taste or better taste, slightly better taste, and then the second half of the film is really in poor taste. And I thought that's really interesting. I thought it was interesting to have, also two people who understand something in between Sia and Scott Walker, obviously do very, very different things, but actually come from similar worlds. Scott Walker was a pop star in the 1960s. He had a band called the Walker Brothers. They were not named Walker and they were not brothers. And so he was sort of born from a sort of confection. But it just so happened that they were all extremely talented young men. And Scott was a really radical visionary that happened to be from the middle of America. But he was really interested in discordant music and these sort of atonal sustains. And I thought it was really interesting that also Sia was one of the only adults that we could approach about the project, because at this point Sia, I think, was in her late 30s and she already had a body of work that existed from this period. There was a very funny debate that was happening at the time when the movie came out, where people were saying things like, this song would have never, been written or been produced.
Choreography, that was another
in the early aughts, and I was like, well, that's very funny because it actually was. This song was written in 2003 or 2001, and but I understand it. Listen, if something is unfamiliar to us, the first time you hear a pop song, you immediately reject it. You go like, that's trash, and then you hear it for the third time, and it's iconic. And what was interesting about this film is that normally, the way also with musicals and stuff, there's a reprise. This film doesn't really have one. So you're constantly being, given new information. And I think that's very interesting because you're really confronted with what a pop song actually is. The same way that, when you land in the city you live in, and for a moment, you really see it, you view it through this other prism, where you see the city for, it's not imbued with nostalgia or whatever makes up the city you live in your mind. You see the city for what it is, which is just concrete and glass, and it's devoid of any meaning at all. And for me, that I wanted people to feel that way about a pop song, and to feel that way about 11 pop songs, and really investigate that feeling, because it's fascinating to watch this pop show that becomes, you've been asking for it for the whole movie, and then it's interminable. It just keeps going on and on and on. and that's really interesting. I think that's interesting. And I think it's interesting that it's a film that rewards, repeat viewings for both the right and probably the wrong reasons.
If you want to applaud, no, that's...
Life is meaningless. Cinema of despair. Our entire catalog fits under the umbrella of Bleak Week. They were like, it's a retrospective of your work. It's Bleak Week.
Well, at the same time, there are all these great strokes of comedy in the film. Do you think of it as being especially bleak? Do you think that there are especially bleak conclusions about, America to be drawn from this? Or do you think it's...
but look at what we're living through. It's absolutely absurd. Does that mean that what's tragic about the moment in time that we're living in is any less tragic? No, it's like we're confronted with these two, seemingly, opposing realities on a daily basis. Every single time we look at our phone, it's do you want to go down door number 1 or door number 2? And they're both fucking nightmares, like absolute nightmares. And I think that it is impossible to satirize a satire. So I refuse to ever call the film a satire because I don't really like satires. And so I wanted the film to exist in this space where people didn't really know what to do with it, because I don't really know what to do with this moment in time that we're living through. I don't really know what to do with the culture. I know that I know that it feels bad, and I know that everyone feels bad, whether you are, geriatric, or if you're my, 11-year-old daughter. Like, you don't feel great about this moment in time, and so of course the film had to exist in this strange space where it's not quite as queasy, it's kind of funny, it's kind of not, and what is it? And I think that's an interesting space to live, because that's a space that no one wants to exist in. No one wants to feel that way, and yet but that's because we feel that way all the time. So of course no one wants to feel that way even more. But I do think it's interesting for me, the reason I'm happy everyone saw it on 35mm tonight is that the film is a period piece. And this was something that I already knew. Like, it was released in 2018. The sequences with Celeste as an adult are dated for 2017, because I already wanted it to be something that was in the past for contemporary viewers. So this, for me, I treated the same way that I would treat a film from the 1950s or the 1920s.
You're a historically minded guy. Do you ever think about how we will depict the present in the future? What right now will look like in 20 years?
I do. I mean, I'm fascinated by the fact that we've run out of ideas. So, like, with it, so we're at the end of history. Like, and so it's this really interesting thing where we've explored these frontiers, the new frontier in the gold rush in the 19th century. It was the last sort of frontier to conquer, and then we ran out of ideas and we decided to settle there and build Silicon Valley. And now we have a new frontier, which is a virtual reality. And so what's really fascinating is that we're living in this moment in time which is like a corpse that's reanimated over and over and over and over again, where everyone is doing sort of a take on the 80s, the 90s. We're seeing it with our daughter, of course, sort of in terms of her fashion, what she's listening to, what she's watching. But everything is always a take on something. There are very few new ideas. So of course that's really frightening. It's incredibly frightening to think that, is this all there is? That's a terrible thing to be confronted with, but I do think it's something we need to talk about, and it's a reality that we should be acknowledging, because essentially, if we look at the culture of music, fashion, photography, fine art, it does appear that we're predominantly just rehashing the same old thing over and 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 over again.
I think it was really great seeing this film again today, because I think having seen The Brutalist, it almost teaches you how to watch it. It teaches you what to focus on. I think both films are about how the work you do has a life beyond its making. Is that in the same way that Laszlo Toth's buildings are interpreted however they might be, in the same way that Celeste's music may or may not have inspired terrorists? I think in the same way, or I guess my question to you is, have you ever felt this way about your work? I remember the release cycle during The Brutalist, this was cited as both a virulently Zionist and virulently anti-Zionist text. How do you feel about your work having a life beyond your making of it?
Yeah, no, I literally, in the span of about 10 to 11 hours, in the morning, someone spat at my feet and called me a Zionist pig, and in the afternoon I was called an anti-Semite. And I was like, how can you be both?
Those were both me, I'm very sorry.
It's very interesting, because no one wants to be disliked. No one wants that. No one yearns to be loathed. That's not why. But I don't yearn for validation either. So I think it's important to do work which is very confrontational and is not, work that is not ultimately a piece of propaganda. I don't make films with an agenda. And it's something I try not to talk about, and it gets me in trouble all the time. But I was asked when I made Vox, do you think that she's a good artist? And I was like, I don't know, do you think she's a good artist? People asked me if I thought that Laszlo Toth was a great architect. No one ever asked me if the child of a leader was a great fascist. He was. He was successful. So I don't, that's just not, it's not how I operate. I am interested in building something which, exists as a monolith to be interpreted. It's a piece of public art. You can piss on it, you can paint on it, you can do whatever you want with it. But ultimately, it has, in a way, once I've given it away to the world, and the films are extremely painful and difficult to make. So all I can say is that they're public facing in the sense that I genuinely want, people to have the option to look at them. But also how they feel about them, ultimately, it's not my place. I can't anticipate what every single person in the room might think, and I would never be so presumptuous as to tell you exactly what or how to think. And so, all I try to do is make sure that the films are, relatively accurate as they can be, as they relate to a virtual history. So, we worked with the greatest architectural consultants on The Brutalist that were available to us. Jean-Louis Cohen consulted on the film that wrote the book on Corbusier, that's in everyone's, living rooms. And on Vox, we hired Britney Spears' producer to do everything, that it produced those songs with her from 18 years earlier. We really think about these things. So for me, I just want it to be correct, and then whatever people project onto it, that's theirs and theirs alone. But you're correct that the films do reflect, that art is of course, artistic expression has a lot more to do with what the viewer imbues upon it, or than perhaps the piece itself. And when you leave a lot of room for interpretation, you leave a lot of room for misinterpretation. But who am I ultimately even to tell someone that they got it wrong? So if somebody's angry, I'm like, well, I get that.
I think, not to cover the same territory, but I remember the reception for VOX LUX being very polarized. Did the more unilaterally positive reception for The Brutalist change your relationship to this film, or how you think about that time, or just how you felt about that chapter of your career?
Not really, because the thing is that I think that it actually takes a while for a film to be defined. So when Vox was released in Venice, the reception was actually way more positive than we expected it to be. Way more. I was like, what? I'm totally confused. We must have fucked up. And then the response following festivals and stuff. Then there was this sort of, it had been just a lot of praise and adoration, and then the pendulum swung the other way. And to me, while I was making the film, that was something I'd prepared for psychologically. With The Brutalist, I prepared myself for that, and ultimately, it was a painful movie for me to put out as well for different reasons. I have to say that good attention and bad attention feel exactly the same. Attention feels bad. It actually does, and we speak in public in order to honor our collaborators and the work. And I'm so grateful, truly, I just think it's worth saying, since I'm sharing a stage with Daniel London, who's one of my favorite actors and who I hope to work with for the rest of my career, and I really mean that he trusted a 17-year-old kid who called him and said, I love your work, and we could come and spend a few days working on this very strange short film. So I'm incredibly grateful. But the only reason that I really, at this point, get out in front of the films is to try to honor everyone else's contributions. Because for me, it's all downhill. There's no, it's you screen it once and then everyone has thoughts and they're like, what you could have done differently? And you're like, well, movies are really, really difficult to make, and I don't know what to say. I'm grateful that you engaged with it. I guess but I also have a life and I have to move on, and this already took me however many years. So I just only have so much time for what it could have been, because of course anything could be anything, and that's the reason that I don't believe in making films by committee. I think that if every novel was written by 30 to 40 contributors, that it would just end up as an exquisite corpse, and it would be absolutely nothing. And that's one of the reasons that I am ultimately not that concerned about the digital age that we're facing, because there will always be a place for artisanal craftsmanship. And the only people who are shaking in their boots are the people that can be replaced.
I find what you're saying very encouraging, and I'm curious, if right now you're in the process of putting together feature number 4, have you found that after Brutalist this has been easier going, that navigating, financing, getting things produced, is it less difficult this time around, more so?
Cassandra Kulukandas, who I've worked with for years, is laughing in the front because she knows how difficult the new one already is.
About crying in the front row, crying laughing.
The new film, in some ways it's easier, but also it's not easier because I'm trying to go further. If I was going to make an historical picture that somehow was evocative of the Brutalist, I would imagine that would be an easier movie to make. The new film is, not for everybody, and that's okay. And so no, it's challenging in different ways, but certain things are getting easier. Like, people have context for our work, so they say no a lot faster. But that's actually helpful. Like, I've wasted years of my life waiting to hear back on someone. It's just now people say I'm definitely not interested in that, and I find it offensive. I think it's really a problem. Good luck. And I think that's an interesting space to exist within. And fortunately, I have...
Still trying to put together the financing.
What'd you say?
I'm still trying to put together the financing, Brady.
Yes.
I feel like people shouldn't be giving you shit at this point. Have you not proven yourself? What's wrong with these people?
That's very... Well, no, yeah, but the financing so far is fine. But it's just getting people to show up, to do it and execute it. That's actually complicated, and it's for a lot of reasons. It's an ornery project. It's a bit ornery. And I think that's okay. I think that if it was comfortable, then it's probably not worth making. Whenever I hear someone and I'm like, how's it going? And they're like, it's great. It's great. And I'm like, really? Like, why? But people, they're like, I feel optimistic. I think it's going to be well received. I think it's really special, and then you just know it's not. They're fucked. Like, they're so fucked, but or maybe they're not. Actually, they're celebrated. I mean, they're like, in the grand scheme of things, they're fucked, because ultimately the work just disappears, but into the void, and into the same void that everyone on Twitter is shouting into, and it just doesn't matter. It's just stuff. It just goes away and evaporates. But I think that those people are happier, and they have happier careers because they're just happy to be there. I am not just happy to be there. I'm not just happy to be there. I think it's a privilege to be there. I'm grateful every single second of the day that I've actually arrived, and the props come out of the box, and the costumes are set up in a storage unit somewhere, and 150 actors and their families have all given them away to me for a period of time. You can have my husband, you can have my wife for 5 or 6 days. I'm really grateful for that. But it's a huge responsibility, and it's intense, and And so I don't know why people don't talk more about how horrible, like it's a horrible experience. Making films is really painful. And I think it's okay that it's painful. It should be painful, the agony and the ecstasy and all that.
Well, if there are any billionaires in the house, I have a terrific investment opportunity for you. But in the meantime, let's hear it for Mona, Daniel, and Brady.
Thank you, Carl.